Hello and welcome back to the Ages Variety Show. Today is the start of a brand new sub-series, the CFB Starter Pack. Some of you might actually have questions about what college football might be. So if you're wondering what that is, these videos are for you. It'll explain everything, and this is just the first one, explaining about conferences and how they came to be, and all the teams included in them. So buckle up and join along for the ride, because this series is about to get interesting. Of course, you can't start talking about all the conferences in college football without mentioning the Big Ten, the oldest of the conferences. As you can see, before the conferences began, there were just independent teams just scheduling each other, but eventually there had to be some groundwork, which is where the conferences came in. Before the Big Ten, there was an athletic association of the Northwest, which broke up after 2 seasons and only had 4 teams. Now, 7 teams initially formed this Big Ten, which was then called the Western Conference. By about 1910, the Western Conference actually had 9 teams. Every team in the modern Big Ten, well, basically Michigan, Illinois, Northwestern, Purdue, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. But they didn't have Ohio State nor Michigan State. They actually had a little school named Chicago instead, who nowadays plays Division III. They also had Racine University of Wisconsin at one point. So it was a bit hectic. In the early days of the conference, Chicago and Michigan were big powerhouses, and they actually competed frequently for the top spot in the conference. So if you can imagine, it was very competitive back then. Wisconsin and Minnesota also managed to get a reign on it, but unfortunately for a stretch of about 7 years, Michigan did leave the Big Ten because they did not follow the rules. And yeah, then Ohio State joined in 1916. Chicago unfortunately departed in 1936 after a heated debate about what to do with the school football program. And then Michigan State joined in 1950, and they became the Big Ten for the next 40 years. The Big Ten was able to remain this way for so long because it was the perfect conference at the time. And as you could imagine, perfect conferences don't stick around longer past 1990. Which is where Penn State finally joined in. They had 2 national titles under the belt as an independent, and they were coming in hot. For the next 20 years, the Big Ten actually had 11 members, and they would never have 10 members again. In 2012, they actually accepted 3 teams. Maryland from the ACC, Rutgers from the Big East, and of course, Nebraska from the Big Ten. None of those teams have done particularly well in conference play, as in the most recent years. However, in 2024, 4 schools, Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA, all joined the Big Ten, increasing their membership to 18 teams, and they're called one of the 3 Sea to Shining Sea conferences. And to be honest, I think that the conference has come a long way from its origins. The reason why I explained it this long is because such a rich conference, such a big conference, a long-lasting conference, has such a rich history of just existing, you know? Anyway, moving on. And then, just west of the Mississippi River is your Missouri River Valley Conference. Yes, that one. It included teams from Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, Tennessee, you know the drill. There were teams in there like Duquesne, Drake, Wichita State in there over the years, but eventually 6 of them decided to break off to form their own conference, the Big Six. They were Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, Kansas State, Missouri, and Iowa State. By 1920, this conference had been fully formed. Afterward, though, there would be 2 more members to join in the next 70 years. Oklahoma State, followed by Colorado, each from different conferences. Over the years, the Big 8 did remain very, very competitive, and they were among the top conferences in all the sport. Nebraska-Oklahoma rivalry was particularly a big focal point in why the conference existed. Those 2 did compete in the game of the century in 1971 and had dukes between each other during their most dominant eras. Now, the Big 12 is actually a story of 2 conferences because the conference south of that, the Southwest Conference, primarily composed of the Texas teams that you know of. Texas, Texas A&M, SMU, TCU, Baylor. You get the gist. Texas Tech, Rice, and Houston were all added on during the conference's history, as well as Arkansas. But unfortunately, with Arkansas's departure in 1991 for the SEC, the conference crumbled. And so you could probably guess what happened next. Yes, when the Big Eight was looking for new members to join their conference, they naturally looked south. And so Texas, Texas Tech, Texas A&M, and Baylor became the newest members of the Big Eight, which became the brand new Big 12. From 1995 until 2011, this was actually one of the more dominant conferences, split between North and South. It was basically the Oklahoma-Kansas border that shared the North-South divide. But tragedy would strike in 2011 after 16 years of success. By 1920, this conference had been fully formed. Afterward, though, there would be 2 more members to join in the next 70 years, Oklahoma State followed by Colorado, each from different conferences. Over the years, the Big Eight did remain very, very competitive, and they were among the top conferences in all the sport. Nebraska-Oklahoma rivalry was particularly a big focal point in why the conference existed. Those two did compete in the game of the century in 1971 and had dukes between each other during their most dominant eras. Unfortunately, 4 schools decided to leave. Colorado left for the Pac-12, Nebraska left for the Big Ten, and Missouri and Texas A&M both left for the SEC. As you could probably tell, this was a tragedy to the conference, which basically lost their membership. However, TCU and West Virginia did join the conference the very same year. They wouldn't host a conference championship for 4 seasons, but hey, that's the price you pay. They would eventually host one again in 2016. They didn't expand their membership for a while, though, but when they did, they included teams like Cincinnati, UCF, Baylor, and Houston. Tragedy would strike again, though, as Texas and Oklahoma left for the SEC, which left basically just a mumbo-jumbo of conferences, of teams that were in the conference for not that long. Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and Arizona State all joined the Big 12. And thus you have a 16 conference today, another one of those shining sea conferences. I don't know if you could call it that, but let me know down in the comments. Anyway, moving on. Unfortunately, 4 schools decided to leave. Colorado left for the Pac-12, Nebraska left for the Big Ten, and Missouri and Texas A&M both left for the SEC. As you could probably tell, this was a tragedy to the conference, which basically lost their membership. However, TCU and West Virginia did join the conference the very same year. They wouldn't host a conference championship for 4 seasons, but hey, that's the price you pay. They would eventually host one again in 2016. They didn't expand their membership for a while, though, but when they did, they included teams like Cincinnati, UCF, Baylor, and Houston. The next conference I want to explain is the Pac-12. As you could probably know, the Pac-12 is most likely dying after the 2026 season. But let's look back on some of its moments. There were primarily 2 conferences on the West Coast back in the early 1900s. You had the Pacific Northwest Conference, which consisted of Oregon, Oregon State, Washington, Washington State, Eastern Washington, Boise State, Idaho, and Idaho State. Sounds like a lot, but I was the one who created it. And then there was the Far West Conference. All the doodah day California teams. As you might know, the best of those teams eventually merged into the Pac-8 by 1962, and eventually incorporated Arizona and Arizona State in 1978. The conference remained this way for over 30 years until Utah and Colorado decided to join the Pac-12, officially splitting the conference into 2 divisions, North and South. Now, obviously, the Pac-12 has been through its process of dying for a few years now, as 10 of their 12 members left, and unfortunately, the final 2 members of the conference will leave the conference after the 2026 season, or rumors say. There have been rumors of that the Pac-12, reuniting in some form, but no one's really buying into it at this point, and it's just, once you're dead, you're dead. So, rest in peace, Pac-12. Take a moment of silence for everyone. Of course, as you could imagine, in 1952, there was a lot of controversy in the NCAA, especially around scholarship sanctions and brand new rules that apply to every conference, regardless of region. However, there were 7 schools that were upset between the areas of South Carolina and Maryland, and those schools eventually formed the ACC, although some did not join until later. The original members were South Carolina, Clemson, the 4 North Carolina schools, Virginia, and Maryland. Peaceful conference, right? Well, not so fast. South Carolina unfortunately departed in 2011, but before that, they already gained Virginia Tech, Pittsburgh, Syracuse, Boston College, and Florida State to replace them. So they had 12 members. And counting in Georgia Tech and Louisville, now you've got 14 members. And then with SMU, California, and Stanford's joining in 2024, now you have a 17-team Sea to Shining Sea Conference. I mean, let me know in the comments. Do any of you think that a Pacific team should be added to an Atlantic Coast Conference? Why or why not? The last major conference I want to explain about is the SEC. Yeah, before the whole SEC began, it was actually several different conferences, although the schools did unite at one point to form the Southland Conference, or the Southern Conference for short. They had 32 official members, and they were supposed to regulate football south of the Mason-Dixon line. Clemson was a member, as well as most of the North Carolina schools and Virginia schools. Even Maryland was a member for a time. Yeah, but something got to change. In 1932, something did change. 13 schools abandoned the Southland to form their own school, the SEC. Of course, it had the original guys: Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Auburn, LSU, Tennessee, Florida, Kentucky. What was the last one? Oh, shit. Either way, Tulane, Georgia Tech, and Sewanee of the South were all former members. Sewanee left after never winning a conference game, but it took Tulane and Georgia Tech 30 more years before they finally departed. And so it was. For almost 30 years, the conference was very peaceful until Arkansas and South Carolina both joined in 1991. My mistake on the South Carolina thing joining in 2010. But either way, this is when the original conference championship was created. I mean, you got two divisions, and the winner of those played for the conference championship. It's as simple as that. Anyway, Missouri and Texas A&M were added, followed by Texas and Oklahoma, and now you've got a conference that extends from the southwest to the southeast of the United States. Do you think this is the Sea to Shining Sea Conference? Why or why not? Anyway, some of the smaller conferences that existed in college football are really just as interesting as their big school counterparts. I mean, first off, you got the Big East, whose history is way too complicated to explain. They had schools like Miami, Virginia Tech, West Virginia, Rutgers, UConn, Temple, USF, UCF, Louisville, Cincinnati, even Boston College throughout the years. Yeah, so people were rotating in and out, but today they have Army and Navy, so way to go. You've also got Conference USA. It's basically just another one of those tricky conferences. It used to be based in the southeast United States, but it's almost like they're spread everywhere, from Virginia to, quite literally, New Mexico. This could be another one of those Sea to Shining Sea conferences, but previous members did include Southern Mississippi, Memphis, East Carolina. USF was also in here. TCU, SMU were in here. So, yeah, this conference does have a bit of prestige behind them. And then, of course, you got the conference that wasn't supposed to be a conference, the MAC. This conference was actually founded in 1946, but in 1956 was placed as a college division sport, you know? They eventually were promoted to the university division in 1962, and that is where things began. You pretty much got the basics, and then you have Marshall and UCF willing to play, and now you have UMass, who literally just had a winless season. I'm at a loss for words, just think about it. The West, meanwhile, might actually have one of the most interesting stories of conflict between the conferences. There actually used to be two conferences back in the day, the WAC and the Mount West. Utah, BYU, and Boise State all used to be in the Mount West, while the WAC was home to teams like TCU and Hawaii and things like that. In all, it was just so complex that teams were literally just floating in and out of each conference, but eventually the two of them came to an agreement and formed what is today the modern-day Mountain West, set to gain Washington State and Oregon State in the 2027 season. The Sun Belt, meanwhile, is one of those conferences that primarily stayed where they wanted to be. I mean, you've got teams like FAU, FIU. However, Utah State and Idaho have also been teams there in the past, which tell you something. But for now, they're mostly a team that pretty much expands just a little less than the SEC. And to be honest, I think this conference is probably one of the strongest, partially because they actually have divisions. They're the only conference to have done so now. And James Madison, Marshall, Texas State, Louisiana are all modern members. Anyway, I think that should help get to, help the starter pack on a good note. And if any of you want to drop, like, subscribe for another part 2 of this, I would be glad to do so, even though I'm probably going to do so anyway. Anyway, The Age, peace out.